Howdy, Immortalium here, and today I'm doing a video game review, to be more specific, Final Fantasy XII. Now, about Final Fantasy XII, before I start explaining my own personal opinions on it, I better just say something. This has got to be the most divided game in the entire main series of Final Fantasy. The critics loved it, as can be seen by their scores, but the fans absolutely despised it. I'm more mixed than either of those opinions. Let's get into the main plot of the story first. So, Final Fantasy XII, it opens up with us finding out that there's these three two main empires and a kingdom. There's Rosaria and Arcadia, and they've been at war for ages. They're two massive empires. You have this little kingdom in between called Dalmasca, and Dalmasca is invaded by Arcadia. Now, at the beginning of the game, we are put in the role of a soldier called Rex. And Rex witnesses the end of the war, that's the best way to put it. And we skip on 2 years later to the capital of Dalmasca, Rabanastre. And at Rabanastre, where we meet Vaughn, who is living with a girl called Penelope. And Vaughn is a thief. And he decides, when the new governor from Arcadia comes along to, he comes into a position of power of Rabanastre, Vaughn decides, to sneak into the palace and steal some items. And that's how the story begins. Now, throughout the course of the game, we gather up a party. We have Vaughn, we have Fran, we have Balthier, we have Bosch, we have Ash, and we have Penelope. And here is my biggest issue with Final Fantasy XII. Many other people have issues with Final Fantasy XII for reasons other than this, but in my opinion this hurts the game more than any other component, and that is the characters are among the most bland that I've ever seen in a Final Fantasy game. Not that they didn't have potential, but just that it was never really expanded upon. Like, let me give you a good example. The first Final Fantasy game I ever played was Final Fantasy IV. And I'd say there was probably no dungeon throughout all Final Fantasy IV where there wasn't like a plethora of cutscenes as you progressed throughout it, which developed the characters and their relationships to one another. In Final Fantasy XII, I can't really think of any dungeon where there was an actual cutscene in the middle. It always seemed to be at the beginning and at the end. There was no real development. And that several characters, you're kind of wondering why the hell are they along for this adventure. So I had issues, empathizing with the motives of certain characters, with the emotions of certain characters. It's from a story perspective and from a character perspective, it's fairly poorly handled for a Final Fantasy game, and that includes its ending. By the end of the game, which at that point I put over 90 hours into the game, I had pretty much given up on the plot by that point. I knew that the characters weren't going to get properly developed or anything, but even then I was disappointed by the end to Final Fantasy XII. I thought it was one of the most cliche ways it could have, completed its plot. So, from a story and character perspective, quite poorly handled. Which definitely, like an RPG, one of the major cruxes of RPG experiences is the characters and story. So that majorly hurts it. Now, from a gameplay perspective, and this is where I hear most people criticize the game, I don't think it's as bad as people make it out to be. Now, the first thing you'll notice from the gameplay is the combat system. GOM is the active time battle combat that we know from previous Final Fantasy incarnations. Now everything takes place in kind of a pseudo real time. You are in control of one character of your party of three. You target your opponent, you select a command from your menu, and the character charges up a bar and attacks if they're within a certain distance. But this is all done real time. You can run your characters around real time. The actual combat itself is actually turn-based, so it's a pseudo real-time combat system. The two other characters, are AI controlled, but there's a gambit system which allows you to set up, how the characters will react in certain situations. Something that I don't think had been seen at that point, but has been implemented into other stuff. I remember a very similar system in Dragon Age, for instance. But the combat system, it's not as good or as engaging or as tactical as other Final Fantasy combat systems. But really, there was only one point, well, not one point, I should say, one one type of instance, that really annoyed the hell out of me from a combat perspective. And that was when a large number of spellcasters were involved in the battle, because they would have to charge their spells, all these characters, and at that point you realize that it's a turn-based system, because your characters are just standing in front of the enemy, the enemies are charging up one after another, and you can't do a single thing, to stop any of them, which is annoying as hell. So that was the only point where I really thought that the combat system worked against the game. The rest of the game, there were some great ideas. I liked the idea that you could run around, and as you run around, you actually can regain your MP. So, the combat system, it's not the best. It's probably, one of the lesser ideas that they've ever had for a combat system in Final Fantasy. But it's not as bad, in my opinion, as everyone makes it out to be. Now, the license grid. The license grid is basically the way that you develop your characters in this game. Basically, you have a grid board, and you can expand to any license beside one of your already unlocked licenses. In battle, you gain license points. In general, it's one license point for every enemy kill, but there are exceptions to that. And these licenses apply to weapons, to spells, to stats improvements, etc., etc. And it's potentially a very interesting system. But by the midway point, about maybe 40 to 50 hours in, I had pretty much stopped using the license grid. Do you know why? Because, basically every component of the board, whether it be a weapon, type of grids, or stat-based grids, etc., are all beside each other. So by that point, I had already pumped all of my license points into the stats, and the only time I would ever come back to the license grid was when, a major story development had happened, and that meant an unlocking of new spells and weapons and armor. Besides that, I never really used it. So I thought that was a major flaw, because one of the great feelings of RPGs is the fact that when you're going through a dungeon and you gain access to new stuff, you feel more powerful and more satisfying. So that was a major flaw, in my opinion. I think it could have been handled better. That's the best way to put that upgrade system. Now, there is a leveling up system. Your character does level up from experience gained, but that only seems to affect your health, your MP, and it also affects your stats, but not in a way that you can control. So basically, the license grid is the only way where you really get to control how your character develops. Now, this is a big game, but I didn't really use, any of the side quests, really. I did some, but they're quite problematic to find. There's no indicator that a character wants you to do a particular quest or anything, so quite often I would just run by them. Otherwise, I would have to actually go to each individual person in town and talk to them in order to see if they had anything for me to do. So I think some kind of indicator would have been far more effective. What I ended up doing, and actually what took up a lot of my time during Final Fantasy XII, is this thing called a mark system. Basically, there's these kind of boards that you can find at kind of inns and taverns throughout Final Fantasy XII, which have you hunting down these marks or these bosses or enemies, and you get a reward when you kill them. Basically, it's like a quest, kill a big boss quest. I had a lot of fun during the boss battles. And so, a lot of them are quite fascinating, but I must admit the actual rewards were quite disappointing for a lot of them. Near the beginning, I was quite satisfied with a lot of rewards. I can remember I killed this flan creature, and I got this really epic bow, which was far more powerful than any bow I had before. But by the time I got into the later portions of the game, quite often a lot of the equipment I was getting from these bosses were, actually weaker than my equipment set. So I actually fought a lot of the later marks from an enjoyment and completionist perspective. So, that's... I think it held up very well for maybe the first half of the game. but by the last half it had become kind of a pointless system, so I was kind of disappointed in that by the end. But I still slew most of the marks, so, you know, that says something. It was fun, I will say, and that's probably the most fun I had throughout the entire game, hunting down those marks and finding out how to kill them. From a graphical perspective of Final Fantasy XII, it's a PS2 game, so, you know, don't expect amazing graphics, but from a technical perspective, it is a very strong game. Now, from an artistic perspective, I would say that Final Fantasy X was a better game, just from an artistic perspective. But from a technical perspective, I will say that the graphics in Final Fantasy XII are superb. They're very good. The musical score for Final Fantasy XII, it's good. I will say that. I was never really in a situation where I said, God, I hate this music, but not much of it was particularly memorable. In fact, the most memorable soundtrack was when I was hunting down this boss, I think it was called Yojimbo. And the sound piece that played when I fought him was actually very good, very, very well written, and quite catchy. It was the only one that I looked for in YouTube and actually listened to, although I only listened to it a couple of times and I kind of gave up on it. So, for the score, it's good, but it's kind of forgettable. So, you know, that is a weak component of it. The voice acting's okay. I've heard better in a Final Fantasy game. Some of it's a bit cringy, but overall it's not bad. It's not great either, in my opinion. I know it was highly praised at the time, the voice acting, but I looking at it now, I don't see anything particularly special. So, overall, what is my opinion of Final Fantasy XII? Well, I'll say that it's better than Resonance of Fate. I wasn't that keen on Resonance of Fate. But it is a weaker game than Dragon Quest VIII. Like, I would have recommend that you play Dragon Quest VIII before you play Final Fantasy XII. Now, it's not an awful game, and I will say I did enjoy many portions of it, but it's definitely one of the weaker Final Fantasy games. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say the weakest, but it is, you know, a fairly weak Final Fantasy game. So if I had to give it a score, I'd probably give it. It's a between 7 and 7.5. I'm not sure which one. Probably a 7, but you know, yeah, I'd say 7. It's a 7 out of 10. It's a fine game. You know, it's not anything special, and I would have probably given up halfway through if I didn't want to complete it so badly. Which would have been about when the marks started getting weaker. So probably most people, you'll play it halfway through, and you'll find it decent, but you'll forget about it soon. So, if you want it, get it. I recommend personally getting the new Final Fantasy X and X-2 HDs, which I haven't gotten yet, but I have very fond memories of them and do intend to pick it up at some point. So yeah, that's my review of Final Fantasy XII. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye-bye.